Hello, classmates. It is your classmate, Charles, reporting live from Aruba. And today I wanted to take you through my presentation on Arizona's smart growth legislation and its impact on economic development. First, let's start with a little overview of smart growth. I am sure everyone is familiar with this concept. We've covered it in class. But a couple overarching principles and thoughts on it. One definition is it's policies that enhances the quality of life for future and existing residents, protects the natural environment, and facilitates efficient and affordable provision of services. And below are 10 principles outlined by Smart Growth America, an organization that promotes smart growth policies throughout the country. I won't take you through all of these or all of them. Everybody should be generally familiar with them. But in general, smart growth is a set of policies and ideas designed to make more efficient urban development and that takes a different form in every state, in every different situation based on kind of the political and public priorities and values and the cultural background. So smart growth is a very overarching term with a lot of different principles and policies attached to it, and it manifests itself differently in different places. Um, Smart growth is achieved through regulation and or incentives. Usually it's a combination of both, kind of just like every public policy, but it's aimed towards directing or guiding urban development. So you can either do that by forcing it through regulation or incentivizing it. And most plans have a combination of both, and I don't think a plan that only had one would be very good. As I mentioned, it's a little different in each state how it manifests itself. Western states tend to focus on preserving open space, while Eastern states try to focus on containing urban sprawl and minimizing the costs on public facilities. Usually, again, that just reflects where the states are culturally and in their own development. Eastern states are a little more open to tighter control and controlling development, while Western states kind of appreciate the beauty and open space that comes with being in the West, and that's why they try to protect it. Those are really just generalizations, though, and every state kind of has a different variation, as I've mentioned already, and they reflect public and political priorities and values. Smart growth legislation kind of came at us in three waves. It's broken down into three waves. The first one started in the 1970s and kind of came out of those environmental movements of the 60s and 70s. So kind of the first piece of legislation we point to is Oregon's 1973 urban growth boundary. Legislation, every urban area had to come up with an urban growth boundary. And again, came out of the environmental movement about preserving space and preserving our natural environment. Second wave came in the mid 80s, early 1990s, and you see gave attention to the provision of infrastructure, housing, economic development, community character, and quality of life. So just adding some things beyond just open space preservation and natural preservation to it. And then the third wave, even more so, even more focused on scourging urban sprawl and giving funding incentives and a little more hands-on. Kind of exemplified by Maryland, which is very hands-on and directs funding to specific places that it wants to see development happen. So Arizona's smart growth legislation came about in 1998. And it's not included in that kind of third wave. And I'll discuss that a little later why it's not. But first, the reason it came about is because of the explosive statewide growth, especially through the second half of the 20th century. From 1950 to the current time period, Arizona's added like 4 or 5 million residents, and especially in Maricopa County and the Phoenix area, which has grown to be the 12th largest metro region, and is really characterized by urban sprawl and leapfrog development. And our legislation kind of came out of those environmental concerns and preserving open space that you saw a lot earlier. People saw the desert and the mountains disappearing very quickly. So in 1998, the Sierra Club and some other environmental groups introduced a ballot provision that would have imposed urban growth boundaries on urban areas. Uh, it was kind of clear that this wasn't written by urban planning people. It wasn't super well conceived, and it actually failed to get even enough signatures to appear on the ballot. But it kind of opened everyone's eyes that now's the time to do something. So in 1998, Governor Jane Hull and the legislature passed the Growing Smarter Act, and Proposition 303 also passed. The Growing Smarter Act is really the smart growth legislation. Proposition 303 was kind of like a tag along piece of legislation that dedicated $220 million over 11 years to preserving open space in Arizona, kind of addressing a lot of those concerns. And then in 2000, the Growing Smarter Plus Act was passed. And this just kind of added on a couple things to the previous, to the act from 1998. So the Growing Smarter and Growing Smarter Plus acts. Right there, you can see that first paragraph is the acts summaries and definitions of themselves. It's straight from the legislation. But what they generally did was they're geared towards the comprehensive and general plans of municipalities. It made them stronger, made them more important, and put some requirements in there for what they needed to include. I'll get into those details a little bit more. But generally, general and comprehensive plans had to be updated every 10 years. So they had to be current. Before that, ones hadn't been touched ever, if they had ever even been created. And the plans had to contain certain key elements. A big part of it was also requiring greater public participation based in the formulation of the general or comprehensive plans and when changes needed to be made to them. So it definitely didn't get into the details of some of the more extensive plans that came out along that time period, like Maryland's. And that's why it's kind of not considered as part of that third wave. It's kind of its own thing that happened along that time period. It doesn't follow that trend. But it is Arizona's attempt at smart growth legislation. So some details about these two acts. Right there are the key elements that every plan needs to contain. There's 8 elements there, and the amount that they need to contain actually depends on the population size of the municipality. The biggest ones have to hit all 8 elements. Smaller ones just have a couple key ones that they have to hit. And actually, water resources was added in 2000 with the Growing Smarter Plus Act, and energy was added again in 2007 with a really minor act that just plugged that in there. Also, some details. Underlying zoning changes must strictly conform to the use identified for the land in that plan. So if you're trying to make a change to the zoning of a parcel of land, it has to strictly conform to what was designated in the general plan. Before, it only had to be in basic harmony. So, as an example, you could go from low density to high density without making a plan amendment. But now, because those elements were in basic harmony, but now you need much more strict conformance. And also, municipalities have the ability to designate what constitute a major or minor plan amendment. So municipalities, they get to decide what's a major amendment and what's a minor one, but it kind of set up some mechanisms for how they have to deal with those. So again, it's kind of very similar to the previous one. It really makes the general and comprehensive plans stronger and more of a factor in land use than they were previously. Additionally, it gave some tools to municipalities to deal with some of their land use issues and geared towards smarter growth principles. For example, municipalities are authorized to designate service area boundaries beyond which public facilities are not extended at the public expense. Counties are authorized to impose development fees to offset capital costs for public infrastructure. So 2 things geared towards making sure the municipalities aren't burdened by the costs of installing infrastructure and public facilities. Something we've talked a lot about in this class. Didn't kind of mandate anything or provide any money to solve these issues, but it did give municipalities some tools to deal with those issues. Cities are authorized to create infill incentive districts. We have one here in Tucson. And municipalities may not annex adjacent land unless they have a plan to provide services and infrastructure within 10 years. So similar to that first issue about about extending services to new land, this is more of a control. Interestingly enough, is more of a control on municipalities rather than a tool. It's kind of like it's a little bit of a governor on municipalities to make sure they don't get out of control. We usually blame this kind of stuff on development, but this one reins in the municipalities in that issue. So, how does the Growing Smarter Act contribute to economic development? Well, that idea, first and foremost, relies on the premise that smarter land, smarter plans lead to better urban growth patterns, which are naturally conducive to long-term economic development. Um, it's relatively light on details that are directly tied to economic development. There are some, but this legislation is just geared towards providing a solid framework for every municipality to have a good general or comprehensive plan that is tied into smarter growth principles. So while it's light on details, it does create a kind of a better, more stable, more predictable environment for businesses to try to do business in, for housing, for development to occur in. And hopefully through this and through some of those measures in there, the public sector is going to have be in a better financial position and have a better budget, less burdened by debt obligations. All of this assumes that the plan is going to be well done. It makes plans stronger, it makes them a big deal. If the plans aren't well done, well, they're going to be bigger impediments to economic development. So that's kind of one worry with this. But I guess through putting those key elements in there and vetting them through more public participation, you're safeguarding against that the plans will actually not be well done. So yeah, its main contribution to economic development is just kind of creating a better, smarter world for economic development to occur within. So some of the additional items in there outside of just those big mandates for general plans, authorization for development fees promotes concurrency. So making sure that development pays for itself at the time that it has an impact on the public budget. Um, so that's again something we've talked about in our last assignment was a big deal. Downside, this could drive up the cost of development beyond what is reasonable if those impact or development fees are too high, something Dr. Nelson has worked a lot on. Authorization to designate service boundaries. This gives municipalities a way to say no to expensive development. Again, this is kind of a check on municipalities, and it also gives them something to fall back on in the face of public pressure and lets them kind of set things up in advance. This could go too far in restricting market forces, though. Major and minor amendments in zoning conformance bring greater predictability to the development process. So this makes sure that these plans we set up just don't change in the short term. If you have a plan and it's a good one and it's for the long term, you should stick to it, and not just because some short-term good deal comes up and a well-connected developer wants to change it, or for whatever reason the winds are blowing. So this is going to bring greater predictability and stability to the environment, which is better for everyone overall. Downside, this could make regulations too rigid and impede growth. Think about the San Francisco Bay Area. They are not bending on a lot of their land use laws to create higher density and to adapt to market forces, and housing affordability is skyrocketing. Authorization to create infill incentive districts creates high density, good urban form. We've talked a lot about that again. So these infill opportunities and high density opportunities are usually good for economic development. Potential downside is they may over subsidize development, and sometimes when you do these, it puts the development in areas where the public facilities are already overtaxed. There's a lot of people in central Tucson, schools are taxed, everything's at the limits, and if you just started dropping more people, it could make that problem even worse. So those are just some potential downsides, but those are also how those things contribute to economic development. All right, so in conclusion, Growing Smarter Acts do a good job of making sure that each municipality has a solid plan in place. Contains those key elements, makes them important, and makes municipalities think about their plans and put some importance on them. I use that word solid. It's not the most laudatory term. We're not going to necessarily have ground-breaking plans, but we're going to have pretty good ones that are going to set a pretty good environment and a pretty good framework and structure for our areas to grow in and for urban development to occur in. Gives municipalities more tools in their toolbox to promote, control, and incentivize good urban form. So gives them a little more ability to gear us towards those smart growth principles. It's far from comprehensive and mandates little and funds even less. That's why it doesn't get grouped in with those other ones around that wave. But this is Arizona's version and Arizona's attempt at smart growth legislation. Leaves the details up to the municipalities, so long as they don't forget those key elements. It's up to the municipalities. You know, overall, this kind of reflects the political and cultural values of Arizona. Like I said, every state smart growth legislation is going to do that. We're a Western state. We value our independence, small government. You know, we're the frontier out here, and so our smart growth legislation reflects that. Doesn't have a lot of the details of mandates. Just goes towards making sure we have a better. Our plans are a little smarter and they're more important, and creates a better overall environment. So that's a Growing Smarter Acts and our smart growth legislation in Arizona, how it ties into economic development. Obviously, some recommendations would be to add some more specific elements to it, but you know, we still generally have the same political and cultural values. So I don't know if those will ever happen, but we've at least, I know I've said it, but we've got a pretty solid framework from which to operate from, and that's better than some areas. So we should be applauded for at least what we have. So thank you for sitting through this. I hope everyone found it exciting. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or grab me next semester. But for now, signing off from Aruba. Hope everyone has a good winter break.